My name is Bob Boston, and it's my pleasure today to interview my law partner, Jim Doran. We are at the law offices of Waller, Lanston, Dorchin Davis in Nashville, Tennessee. It's April the 13th, and this interview is being conducted for the Legal History Project of the Nashville Bar Association. Jim, good morning.
Good morning, Bob.
It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you today. I've been looking forward to our session. What's your full name?
James Marion Doran, Jr.
Does that make you feel like a witness in the witness box?
It does. It does.
Where have you spent your legal career?
Well, I've spent all of my legal career, except for the first 3 or 4 months, in Nashville at 2 firms.
They were?
The first was when I joined it, Manier, Crouch, White, and Herod. It's now Manier and Herod. And since 1998, I've been at Waller, Lanston, Dorchin Davis.
That's a very unusual career path compared to many that we see nowadays in our profession.
It is unusual.
Why did it work that way for you?
Well, Manier, Crouch, White, and Herod, because I came to Nashville in 1970 looking for a job and knocked on every door in Nashville with at least 2 names on it. And I was fortunate enough that one of the partners at Manier, Jim Camp, who is now deceased, had been taught by my father in high school. And he said, if he's half as smart as his father, we ought to hire him.
You mentioned that you came to Nashville. I wonder from where you came.
I came directly from the Air Force, active duty in the Air Force, but I grew up in Sparta, then Cookeville, Tennessee, and had expected to go back to Cookeville to practice, but decided to come to Nashville instead.
Were you one of several children or by yourself?
There are 4 of us. I have 3 sisters. I'm the second child.
You have always been known, probably to your embarrassment, in the Nashville bar as being an ageless looking person. How old are you, Jim?
I'll be 72 in a couple of months.
This is your what year of practicing law?
45th practicing law in Nashville.
What was it like growing up with those 3 sisters?
Yeah, it was delightful. I have, to this day, a great relationship with all 3 of my sisters, and a really great relationship with at least 2 of my brothers-in-law.
Are any of them in the legal profession?
No. Nobody in my family that I know of in history has ever been in the legal profession.
What were your grandparents like, Jim? Did you know them growing up?
I knew my two grandfathers. I knew, well, no, I didn't know one of them. My father's father died when I was 2, but his wife lived until long after I started practicing law. That grandmother, my grandmother's mother, died when I was 7 years old, and my mother's father lived to age 87. So I knew one grandfather well and one grandmother well.
When being from Sparta and Cookeville, were you a city boy or did you live out in the country?
I lived in the country when we were in Sparta. And my father got a job teaching at Tennessee Tech when I was 13, and we moved to the big city of Cookeville.
Growing up in that age in Cookeville, what was it like?
Cookeville, I would say, one of the best small towns in Tennessee, because it had the influence of the college and a lot of well-educated people, and I just fell into some really good friendships in that town.
Were you a good student?
I was a good student. I wasn't the best in school, but I was a good student.
Did you go to Tech?
I went to Tech. I did. That was the only place I thought I could afford to go.
And your course of study was what?
I started out in pre-med and finished with a major in biology and history.
Did you
Which
have
is
your
a bit
father as
odd.
did you have your father as a professor?
No, I would not have taken any courses under my father, although I took more math courses than I needed to because it was easy for me.
When you were in undergraduate school at Tennessee Tech, did you know going in where your career would take you?
Had no idea. I thought I was going to be a doctor when I started.
What changed?
When I was a junior in college, and you went 3 years then, and then you went to medical school, I suddenly said, I don't really want to go to medical school. And so I started thinking. I didn't know any lawyers well, but I went to church with a couple. But I said, you know, I'm going to take the law school admission test. Disappointed my father, I think, but he became proud of the fact that I went to law school.
Did you have an engineering background?
No, I didn't have an engineering background. I always found chemistry, biology, physics, and mathematics courses easy. Why I ended up in history, I don't really know, but I loved it too.
Where did you go to law school?
Went to UT,
And
University of Tennessee.
how did you pick UT?
I picked UT because I thought I could afford it. It was $90 a quarter at that time, and Vanderbilt was a lot more expensive. Never thought about any other schools.
Did you put yourself through school, or did your
I
parents
did.
do that for you?
I did. I borrowed $1,500, lived on that, and paid my tuition and books for the first year, and then I worked from then on.
When you worked, did you clerk while you were in law school, or did you get out of the profession during the summers?
I did a number of things when I was
Including?
in law school. I was a substitute route salesman for Nabisco out in the country all around Knoxville. I assembled lawnmowers and bicycles at a department store. I worked in the business school library, and I clerked for actually doing mostly investigations. I learned to take a statement from somebody, but clerked for a couple of different law firms while I was in school too.
Were you shy?
I was shy.
You're somewhat reserved, somewhat to many people.
I've always
noticed that.
been shy.
Yeah. How'd you get over it to be the success that you've obviously become in our profession?
I'm not sure I ever got over it, but I learned a valuable lesson the first time my law firm, Manier, sent me to a meeting, national meeting of an organization.
What happened?
And, you know, it was at the Greenbrier in West Virginia, this beautiful place. I'd never been in a place like that before. And I got on an elevator and stuck my hand out and introduced myself to the people on the elevator with me. And a couple got off the floor before mine, and I heard the wife say to her husband, "That was really nice. He made it easy for us. We didn't have to do it."
Have you noticed in the modern day interchange amongst lawyers a departure from that type of civility or that type of openness with people, or not?
It's different, but I don't think there's a lack of that once people are thrown together. But it's harder for people to get together today than it was when I started out.
When you started out, did you know what type of lawyer you wanted to be?
I had no idea.
How did you end up in the courtroom?
Well, I never really thought that being a lawyer was anything other than trying lawsuits. But Manier Crouch, White, and Herod hired me, and they did litigation. They represented insurance companies. And so you were immediately thrown into General Sessions Court. And back in those days, they still were adjusters for a number of insurance companies.
The lawyers were?
The lawyers, law firms, USAA, Geico, Detroit AAA, a lot of insurance companies had law firms that were adjusters, $15 an hour. And as a result of that, we had to be available, had somebody on call during the lunch hour every day. So you had to have somebody in the office during the lunch hour every day to answer those calls, because our phone number was in the directory to call if you had an accident. And we had to go out and be available on weekends, just to go out and take somebody's statement, sometimes immediately after the accident, sometimes the next day. But it was a good learning experience.
Include all types of accidents, serious?
Yes.
Car wrecks?
Everything from car wrecks involving a death to just a minor fender bender.
Interesting. I want to go back for just a moment. When you came to Nashville to search for your first legal job, did you know where you would call upon? Did you know who you would see? Did you have it set up? Did you have a headhunter that assisted you?
No. Keep in mind, the largest firm in Nashville at that time was 11 lawyers. Waller Lanston, Dorchin Davis, and Bass, Berry and Sims each had 11 lawyers at that time. I made 9 at Manier when I started, but I just saw who had 2 names or more on the door and started knocking on doors.
Is this the city that you intended to pick?
Yes, I picked Nashville on purpose.
Well,
I
why?
was married at the time, and my wife got in a PhD program at Peabody.
And you've been here
That
ever
was
since?
I've been here ever since, and I've loved it. It's been a great place to practice law.
As your career has developed, have you ever thought about leaving it to take up another avocation?
No.
Any judicial aspirations that you've ever?
There was a
entertained?
time when I thought I might like to be a federal district judge, but I've never had any real desire to do anything other than practice law.
If you could pick, even today, the type of lawsuit you most enjoy, what would it be and why would you say that?
The types of lawsuits I think I would most enjoy are the types of lawsuits that I have grown into handling for the most part. Product liability cases, because they're intellectually challenging. You get to learn about something new every time you get involved in a case. And plus, I just feel comfortable handling those types of cases. But I've also really enjoyed some of the commercial disputes that I've been involved in. And so my career has been primarily product liability cases, except for the very early years, which was car wreck cases.
You've worked on some of the national level product cases, some of the drug defect cases, the medical devices and others. What's that like when you take your practice here and take it on the road at that scale?
Well, the great thing is that it exposes you to some really, really bright lawyers in different firms all over the country. That's the fun part. The other fun part of that is that you feel proud that you've been selected by a client to be a part of that national team.
You're a very humble person by my own personal knowledge and by reputation. Have you had any experiences where that was a help or a hindrance in working on those national council type teams?
No, I would say that it's probably the biggest hindrance has been that I don't go out and asked to get on those things, and so I have to wait to be asked. So I haven't marketed it as well as I think I could have.
Did you have a role through the history of any of the tobacco litigation?
Never was involved in the tobacco litigation, except way late when the states were entering into their programs that the tobacco companies had to contribute to, and I handled a few motion type things.
You were in
for
this
that.
area of practice, though, when the legislatures took over the, quote, products liability business, weren't you?
The Product Liability Act was after I started. Keep in mind that Tennessee was the third state to adopt strict liability and tort while I was in law school. And I was in the very first law school class where they taught it. Professor Dick Snowell, who was one of the gurus of tort law back then, along with Vanderbilt had a professor. So those two giants of the tort legal profession were instrumental in Tennessee adopting the theory of strict liability and tort.
Thinking
In
back to
1965,
when did you graduate from law school?
68.
Thinking back to that time, were there any professors that you still remember today?
Well,
Who
Dick
was-
Snowell I had for torts.
And what was it about these that you remember?
I remember, number one, that you could go find a treatise written by Dick Snowell on torts, which was one thing, that he was on the restatement committee, and that he was really old. The other professor, two other professors I remember well, Forrest Lacey, who taught contracts, who was a true Socratic method professor, and I loved him. I really liked. The other one I remember, and will never forget, and we became close friends much later, was that I was in the very first class that Don Payne taught on Tennessee procedure when he came back to be a law professor. And that, of course, was before the rules of Tennessee procedure, so it was the old Tennessee procedure, which was just a bear. And he flunked out a third of that class because I left at Tennessee back then, and you were out for good.
Wow.
There were some really good, smart people that were out of law school because of that. They got back in later. Some of them did, but it was tough. In my days, Tennessee accepted people with a fairly minimal law school admission test score if they had graduated from a state university in Tennessee, and then weeded them out. I mean, it was
Have you had teaching
very
experience?
competitive. Only in seminars, doing seminars, and I have taught at some NETA type programs. The one I'm most proud of was being the director of the IADC Trial Academy, and on the faculty.
How does that benefit someone, a participant in that type of an academy?
Well, being a faculty member, you get to learn from all of your other faculty members and learn from watching those students, and it's a humbling but learning experience.
How many trials have you conducted?
I know it's over 300. I couldn't tell you exactly how many, but I know that by the time I'd been practicing 10 years, I'd had over 100 trials, simply because back in those days, and that's excluding general sessions cases, which I I would try 2 or 3 sometimes in a day in General Sessions Court. But you know, we would start another jury with the jury out, and you know, they were 2-day cases, sometimes 1-day cases, sometimes 3 days.
Which ones stand out? Can you remember certain events in certain of those that to this day you can
Stand out?
vividly say, that's what it was like when I was there?
I can remember my very first trial.
What was it?
I was working for a small law firm up in Cookeville, Tennessee, after I had graduated from law school and had taken the bar exam, awaiting the bar results and finding out where I was going to go with the Air Force. And I had been sent over to General Sessions Court to monitor something. And I was sitting there in the General Sessions courtroom, and a lawyer came down and said, Mr. Doran, the circuit court judge wants to see you. I didn't realize the bar exam results had come out that morning, and I hadn't seen them. And I went up to the circuit courtroom. This old judge looked at me and he said, "Young man, I understand you've just passed the bar exam." That was how I learned I passed the bar exam. And I said, well, thank you, sir. And he said, well, I want to welcome you, and I want to swear you in to practice in my court. So he had me come around in front of the bar, raised my hand, swore me in, and he said, now I'm going to appoint you to represent these people. The trial will begin in 30 minutes.
What was their claim?
These 3 people were charged with beating up and robbing a cab driver, and they'd been in jail for 11 days. Now, speedy trial truly was in effect. And I went out and I interviewed them. I ran across the street to this guy who was working for H.S. Barnes, one of the true gentlemen of the bar. And I said, H.S., what do I do? And he said, well, here's a note. Go back and have them sign a note for $75. They'll never pay it, but at least they're going to feel like that you're not doing it for free. And I went and tried that case. I had a juror that I had gone to church with.
It was a jury trial?
Jury trial. A juror that I'd gone to church with and that had been one of my history professors at Tech. And I talked to him all the way through that case. And I said, I just learned I passed the bar exam 30 minutes ago. Please don't hold that against my clients. They were convicted, as they should have been. They were sentenced to 11 days in jail, time served, and fined $50 apiece. I felt like I'd won a huge verdict.
Did you have a good relationship with that judge from that point forward?
You know, that's the last time I ever saw that judge to appear before him. Because when I went back to Cookeville to try lawsuits after that, he had already retired, and he handled just the criminal bench anyway.
How much of your practice has been criminal? That case?
That case and one other.
What was the other one?
I tried a case that was one of my great experiences. I was sitting in the office, and I told you that somebody had to be in the office during the noon hour.
Right.
I was sitting in the office and somebody called for Louis Hollabaugh. And I said he wasn't, that he was out to lunch. And they said, well, we've got to appear in court in 20 minutes. And this was about 12:10. So I said, well, I'll be right over there. And Clore Morton had issued a no-strike order.
Who is Clore Morton?
Judge L. Clore Morton, one of the finest judges I ever appeared before, loved him to death. He was hell with lawyers. He was greatly disliked when he first came to Nashville because he issued the busing ruling. But I really enjoyed being in his courtroom. But he could be very cantankerous. He had issued a no-strike order at the Peterbilt plant the day before. And the night before, there were a bunch of strikers that were still out there. And the union steward and some management people sat in the office with a pair of binoculars and tried to identify who they saw out there, and then went and told the judge they violated your order because they're still out there. My two clients were the two people that were, Morton was having a preliminary hearing for in 20 minutes. I went over there. I asked somebody in the clerk's office what I could do, and they said, well, here's one thing. You need to get them to fill out this form so that they can have an attorney appointed because they can't afford one. And the other is just tell them to plead not guilty. So we did that. And in the course of the day, Morton got a bunch of other names and indicted a number of other people. So I ended up with the very best of the young criminal defense bar in Nashville trying that case. Hal Hardin, you go on and on and on, Barrett, and so when we get to the trial, I've now got really good young criminal defense lawyers sitting with me at counsel table. And we tried those binoculars, put them down on the rail in front of the jury and tried those binoculars for almost a week. At the end of the government's proof, nobody had identified my two clients, but all the other people who were indicted had been identified. And I turned to Hal Hardin and I said, Hal, if this was a civil case, I'd know what motion to make. Tell me what motion to make. And he told me, and I stood up, made my motion. It really made Morton mad, but he said, I got no choice. I have to dismiss them. The other lawyers asked me if I would just stay so the jury wouldn't get suspicious that something was happening. And so I did. I took one of the cross-examinations for them. I'm surprised Morton let me do it since my clients were dismissed. And then the jury acquitted all the rest of them. And Morton got really mad.
He could do that. You served time with the U.S. military before you became a lawyer, is that right?
After I got out of law school, after I passed the bar, but before I started practicing.
What was your?
I got in the Air National Guard, and they sent me to, because it was a small, the unit I got in was a small forward air control post which had a radar van and a communications van. So they sent me to become a communications maintenance officer. So I spent, it was supposed to be a 10-month school in Biloxi, Mississippi. I had to go to officer training school in San Antonio. The 10-month school was interrupted by Hurricane Camille, and so it turned into a one-year school. So in February of 1970, I came to Nashville looking for a job.
Did you overlap or precede the Vietnam War?
Oh, I got out of law school in the middle of it, in '68. And if I had not joined the Air National Guard or some other military service, I would have been drafted. Because back then, you claimed all your exemptions through law school, and then you got drafted because they knew where you were because you've been claiming your exemptions.
after you became a lawyer at the Menier Herod firm, how did you identify how you were going to succeed? Were you good at certain things? Did you just know you had it or you felt it?
There were some things that I felt that I was good at. And
What were they?
I felt that I was good at remembering key details, the ones that I thought were important for a legal theory, and kind of focusing on those and then remembering them throughout. You know, I'm old enough now that my memory's not quite that good anymore. But that was something I was good at, and I was good at understanding just the physical nature of things. You know, trying car wreck cases, you look at the dents in a car and say, okay, I can figure out what angles were involved here. Things like that.
Were there parts of it that frustrated you? For example, do you enjoy discovery?
I don't enjoy discovery as it has developed today. Keep in mind that I started in Nashville in 1970, and the Tennessee Rules of Civil Procedure were adopted in 1970.
Oh, yeah.
So people hadn't quite learned yet how to abuse each other with discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And I think abuse our own clients by not focusing on what really is at issue.
When I arrived in Nashville, it was 1982, and I remember the firm that you were with well. It was known, and still is in many respects, as a very active trial type law firm. Who there did you benefit from in having the opportunity to work with them?
Two people primarily. I think I benefited some from all of them, even Olin White, who by then was not really practicing much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But he had a great reputation as a cross-examiner, but not a preparer.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand,
Was it deserved?
Deserved, yes. On the other hand, Mill Menier would worry a case to death, but this didn't have the native skills that Olin White had. But the two that I benefited the most from were Ed Herod, whom I would consider my mentor, and Louis Hollabaugh, whom I would consider my trainer.
What was it about those gentlemen that
Louis was
put
just
them in
a
those
good
categories?
trainer because he would take you to court with him, but never to just sit there, always he would ease you into different parts of the trial and then come back and critique you on it. Ed Herod, because he had a wonderful mind, but he was also the most honest, honorable man. H.S. Barnes and Cook would have been that way, but Ed Herod, is so gentle and so quiet and so respected by other lawyers in town. And respected in the sense that they trusted him, which to me has always been important.
Mm-hmm. The judges that you've practiced before, I'll exclude the ones that are still on the bench because we never know who will read and listen to your oral history. Any of those that you had particular admiration for?
Jim Swigert, Judge James Swigert.
Remember him?
He was, I think, Jimmy Swigert may have been the smartest judge over on our circuit court at that time, but you really had to be on your toes, and I really liked that. He could be rough. Joe Loser I really liked. Joe Loser had just a great sense of humor and easygoing. But those are the two that I would say I remember best.
It's the worst.
Dutch Ullian had an interesting experience in his court one
Now, who
time.
was he?
But he was a circuit court judge here that Hal Hardin replaced.
Mm-hmm.
But I was trying a case in Ullian's court once. He and Ed Herod were very close friends, and I had a legal issue come up. And I got back to and he took a break, which he did frequently. And I got back to the office, and Ed said, Dutch Ullian called me, asked me a legal question, but I had to tell him that it was one of my lawyers over there trying that lawsuit, and I couldn't tell him the answer.
So you better.
Yeah.
When Jim, what's the worst thing that's happened to you in the courtroom?
Well, the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to me in the courtroom, I was trying a case with Louis Hollaball. And in the middle of trial, Olin White had two in-house counsel from General Electric in town. And we were at that time forming General Electric Capital Corporation of Tennessee. And Olin wanted me to come with him to take him to dinner. I had done all of his research and everything up for it. And we went to dinner, and then they wanted to go down to Printer's Alley. Back in those days, Printer's Alley was famous. Sure. And we got down there and went into one place. Olin got embarrassed because there were women dancing, taking their clothes off. Sat there sideways to the stage with his big long cigar. And finally he got up and left, and he said, "You take care of them for the rest of the night." I got home at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I had to be in court the next morning with Louis at 9 o'clock. Louis could tell that I was green in the gills, probably still a little drunk, not hungover. And he said, "You got the first witness."
Oh.
He knew how to teach you a lesson.
I hope you came out well.
And then we actually did win the lawsuit, but he took me to lunch and made me eat some greasy barbecue and throw up.
Any experiences with particular clients, families, individuals, that you look back on and say, I did that person a service?
Ooh.
Your career has been so varied and different type of litigation that you've done.
Right.
I just wondered if any of those people stuck out in your mind.
Well, some people that really stick out in my mind, the ones that I really am most proud of are some of my pro bono cases that I've taken on, and have taken a lot more time than I thought they would take. But
At this point in your career, you're still very active in that program. Why is that?
Because I love doing it. And I get in some courtrooms that I wouldn't be in my regular practice. General Sessions Court, administrative hearings and things like that.
You know, we all have our obligations to that part of the profession. My experience is similar to you. It's something that you do not as frequently as your regular practice, but when you do it, it seems the reward is much, much greater per time spent.
It is very rewarding.
A lot of the young people at your current law firm look to you at leadership on that. Have you enjoyed working in that role?
I have.
What is it about working with them?
Well, you get to, number one, encourage them to be more active in doing pro bono work. You get to help them understand how to do some of the work. I love working with young people, and I love it when they come ask me questions.
You've also had service as, for example, the Nashville Bar Association president. Do you recall those years?
I do. I don't know why I've never been really active in the Tennessee bar, but the Nashville bar has been a labor of love ever since I joined it. And I think it goes back to those early Nashville bar banquets and picnics,
Mm-hmm.
and the camaraderie that you established there. And so I've always been active in the Nashville bar.
What
and
issues?
I still try to stay active.
What issues did the bar face at the time you led it? Do you recall what was happening?
Yeah, CLE was just getting cranked up.
Interesting.
And the first time I was on, early on, was before we had the disciplinary counsel's office, and the local bar associations did the disciplinary or the grievance complaints. We investigated them, and I was on the grievance investigating committee back in the 70s, which was really interesting. I'm kind of glad that somebody else took it over, but
Yeah.
it was really interesting. And but adjusting to the CLE requirements and figuring out how to fit that into the bar program was the main thing going on. And I'm still on the CLE committee.
Good. You mentioned in your early career, and I found this fascinating, that you also had a hybrid role as an insurance adjuster.
Right.
For a part. What was your first salary as a lawyer?
$400 a month.
And did you earn it?
But we also got to keep half of anything we brought in. So I was taking divorce cases and anything I could get that walked in the door to earn a little extra money.
Did your reputation develop by marketing or word of mouth or what? How did you get to where you are today as one of the deans of our local bar association?
I got there because I had some good senior partners who had some good clients that allowed me to work on those matters for them, and because Ed Herod figured out pretty quickly that I could understand the technical aspects and talk to the experts. And I had one case that we got into that was really fed into my getting into the medical products arena.
What was that?
DES, diethylstilbestrol, was a drug that women had taken back in the 40s and 50s because they thought it helped prevent miscarriage, and they were just learning in the 70s that there were some effects on the offspring. And we had a case here in Nashville that Ed Herod got employed by Merck to handle. And that was my first experience working with a national coordinating council, but he was a brilliant man and a true gentleman from New Jersey, Tom Campion. I'll never forget, he's still practicing. But he said, I will not open my mouth in a courtroom in Nashville. So it fell to me. And I got to spend 9 months reading medical literature for the last 50 years.
Wow.
To prepare, which is a rare thing. And so I became very comfortable reading medical literature and understanding lots of issues. Fortunately, the chemistry and biology in college helped, but it was that experience is what propelled me into the medical products litigation.
Do you have any view on where you think the litigation profession will go in the next 10 to 15 years?
I know how it's already started going, and that is, number one, there are no one-off cases in the product liability arena anymore, because a very sophisticated plaintiff's bar has developed a business model that you got to get lots of clients and then sue. The end result is that there are no one-off cases for local defense lawyers to defend. So it's the nationalization of the practice that I've seen in my career.
If you had,
And to some extent, that applies for business litigation, that sort of thing, except for your local companies. My practice, my clients have almost always been national companies rather than local companies. And I regret that to a very large extent. I'd like to have been more actively involved in the local community, but I was always busy with those national clients.
if you had a relative, a child, or a niece or a nephew, would you steer them to our profession, or would you steer them elsewhere nowadays?
I think somebody with the right skills, I would definitely steer them to our profession.
Are there parts of your career, you mentioned a moment ago, with the national counsel role and the national client role as one of them, are there other places that you would change it if you had it to do over?
Yeah, I think if I had it to do over, I would definitely try to become more involved in the local community, more involved with the local business people, and try to represent some of these good companies we have in Nashville.
How have you found the best way for you to get away from the pressures of what you do? What do you enjoy when you're not lawyering?
I've always enjoyed golf, which I can't do right now because I've had rotator cuff surgery. I thoroughly enjoy sailing, and that's the way I primarily get away.
You and your spouse Ramsey are very active in a lot of things. What's it meant to have her with you the last several years?
It's been a real delight. Both Ramsey and my 4 stepchildren.
Yeah.
A real delight.
As you now enter what year of practice is it? What's your
45th.
Your 45th year of practice. How long will you keep going? Will you go until you can't see any further, or do you have a plan to walk to the sunset?
No, you know, when I started practicing, one thing I noticed about Miller Muneer and Olin White was that they didn't have any interests outside the practice of law. They didn't have hobbies. So when they became too senile to practice law, they didn't know what to do other than come to the office. And I vowed, I won't ever be that. I probably will be, so Bob, you have to tell me. You're too senile, Jim, to come to the office.
I would love to, but I don't anticipate it, knowing the longevity of your family. Your mother lived a long life. She was
87 when she died.
Yeah, and still in good health up until.
Yeah, well, she lived the last 10 years of her life after having had a serious stroke, but still mentally with it.
Jim, one of the things that's been a great benefit to myself and some of your law partners at your current law firm is you joining us at a, relatively speaking, later point in your career. What was it like to make that type of adjustment, coming from a very established firm, moving to another one that had been there about as long?
Well, yeah, they'd been in existence since 1913. But after 28 years there, what I really enjoyed and what really made it easy to come to Waller was to find myself surrounded by a lot of people a lot smarter than I was.
Well, present company is accepted from that, but you've been a pleasure to have as a law partner. Did it cause any frictions or bridges to be burned when you made that professional change?
No. I still have good friends there.
Yeah, and that firm remains in existence.
It has still
going strong as well.
remained in existence, and a couple of people over there are still making a good living on clients I left them.
who are the characters of the Bar Association that you had to be fortunate to work with or against? Any come to
One
mind?
person I'm never going to forget is Jack Madden. Jack represented the plaintiff in that DES case.
Mm-hmm.
But Jack was the guy who was probably best known doing product liability defense work at that time. And it started off with Jack being very difficult to deal with in that case. And back in those days, the trial bar, including judges and DAs and everybody else, would regularly get together at the Capitol Club for a drink. And I had an associate, and Jack had an associate, that was just hammering each other to death with motion practice in that case. And I called Jack and said, "Jack, I'm going to buy you a drink. I'll see you at the Capitol Club in 10 minutes. And I went over and I said, "Jack, I've got great respect for you. But as you know, you can be a real bastard to deal with. But you and I are going to knock heads until one of us is dead anyway. And we don't really need to knock heads over stuff that's not important." And we became good friends after that. He said, "You know, you're absolutely right." But certainly Jack, and you know, there were lots of characters at the bar back in those days.
If you had to pick an adversary in a hotly contested lawsuit that you were handling, who would it be?
Today?
Today.
You know, I don't think I could name a name, but I could name a type.
And that would be?
It would be somebody who was really smart, that I knew was going to challenge me, but who also had enough experience under their belt to understand where you don't need to waste time. And somebody that is that I felt I could trust.
In your career, Jim, 45 years of doing it, tell our listeners what, if anything, you've figured out about juries.
I figured out that you can't figure them out. It's really interesting. I have loved trying jury cases, but and I've won a lot of cases. I've lost some that I really didn't feel that I should have lost. But if you think you can figure them out, you think nowadays, you know, if you got a big case, you got to bring in all these jury analytics type experts, but I'm not sure they got them figured out either.
How do you get over it when you're unsuccessful? What's your mechanism? Does it bother you? Do you live it?
Well, yeah, you're going to live it, because you're going to say, what could I have done better? What did I do wrong? What did I not do? But sometimes you just have to say, you know, it was a close question. Could have called either way, and we'll go away. And if it wasn't a close question, I shouldn't have been in there trying the case.
Mm-hmm. You have, has any of your career put you in the political arena, or the civic arena?
No.
No interest?
No interest whatsoever in the political arena. I get my greatest joy from doing things for the legal profession and the system.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, one of my proud moments is getting asked by the Supreme Court to chair the Advisory Commission on the Rules of Procedure.
Mm-hmm.
That's just one of those things, and I enjoy doing that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I still enjoy being on committees for the Nashville Bar.
Mm-hmm.
So that type of thing, and I've been active in some national organizations, DRI and the IEDC, and that's what I prefer to do rather than be involved in political activities.
If you had a young lawyer or lawyers that came under your tutelage now, how would you cultivate them? What would you tell them they need to do?
I would tell them that they need, number one, if you're going to be a trial lawyer, sit down with the rule book.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing the questions I get. What do the rules say about this? But that's not really, that
Mm-hmm.
sort of half kidding when I say that. I would say get out there and get to know the lawyers that you're going to be opposed to and you're going to be working with.
Mm-hmm.
And treat them with respect, always, and treat their client with respect. And if you do that, you will be treated with respect.
You know, we've always heard that a lawyer's reputation is worth its weight in gold. Have you ever had, what's your toughest ethical situation that you've been placed in, if you remember? Is it with witnesses? Is it with having information? Is it with what somebody has done to you?
I trying to place a tough ethical situation.
It's probably a compliment to the way you've practiced yourself.
Yeah, I don't recall being placed in one that I thought was a really tough. I think probably the hardest thing is some minor infraction and the rules say you're supposed to report it, and you just can't do that.
You're in a unique situation. You started in what many people would call the old days of practicing law, and you're
Right.
still extremely active in the modern days of practicing law.
Right.
So you've bridged both gaps. Do you recall the time when people did not write letters to confirm conversations?
Oh, right, yes, absolutely. But we all wrote lots of letters back then because we didn't have email and
Do you remember,
God forbid,
your first word
God
processor?
forbid if the legal profession should start communicating by Twitter.
It may happen next.
It may.
It may happen next. Have you tried cases all over the country?
I have. I've tried cases only in Tennessee, except for one case that I tried in Iowa.
And what was it?
And I had an opportunity to try some cases on one of these national teams, and elected not to spend months at a time in New York. But the case, my Gold Clause case that I had in Iowa, that ended up going to the 8th Circuit 3 times and the U.S. Supreme Court 3 times, was a fascinating experience.
What was its
in
issue?
federal court in Iowa. The issue,
I remember the case, but I can't recall the specifics.
there was a man that owned a piece of property in downtown Des Moines, Iowa, that he had leased on a 99-year lease in 1917. And at that time, the inflationary clause in leases and other instruments was a reference to gold, because U.S. was on the gold standard. And then in 1933, Roosevelt took us off the gold standard, and then the question became whether after 1975, when Congress reauthorized the private ownership of gold, whether those clauses were still in effect. And there was a beautiful Art Deco office tower on that piece of property. And the people were getting like pennies for what it was worth based on the calculation without the gold standard. And a good friend who was a lawyer but didn't do trial work came to me, and he had some relatives who were the heirs of that man that we came up with a theory that there was a novation in 1993 when the lease was assigned, and we won that theory after the district judge dismissed the case initially, and we went up to the 8th Circuit, and I argued that the district judge had come up with a magic eraser to erase that from that clause from the lease agreement. So anyway, that was.
Did that go to the Supreme Court?
It went up to Supreme Court once because the owner of the building had gone and gotten Senator Louch Faircloth to introduce a bill to basically take away our win after we won it in the 8th Circuit. And because Congress had introduced this new bill, the Supreme Court sent it back to say, well, you got to consider this new bill. Mm-hmm. 8th Circuit said, all right, we've considered the new bill and you win even with it, but the new bill was unconstitutional anyway.
Do you enjoy the appellate advocacy?
I loved it, yes.
Have you always?
Yes, I have.
It's different, it brings in a different skill set. I would think you'd be very good at it.
Whole different skill set, but I've always enjoyed it.
Yeah. Jim, as we get to the end of our discussion this morning about your career and leaving it as the historical archives for the members of the Bar Association and others coming behind you, if you were going to pass on something to the younger generation of lawyers, male, female, that are just now starting out, what would you tell them? How would you help them? What would they benefit from knowing from you?
Your word is your bond. They're all smart or they wouldn't be here. And you don't get anywhere without hard work. And you're not going to get anything but money if you don't develop the trust of the people you deal with.
Do you still see the role of the lawyer in the future as you've experienced it in the past?
It's really hard, but when you see that we have now priced ourselves out of representing a very high percentage of our population.
What part of your 45 years in our profession, Jim, has given you the most personal satisfaction?
Having my fellow lawyers select me to be a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers.
The ACTL is one of the premier organizations that a trial lawyer can aspire to. Have you met others of similar ilk as you across the country in that organization?
I've met others who far exceed anything I've accomplished in that organization.
Even as a 45-year practitioner, if a good case comes in today, do you look forward to digging into the file the first day to figuring it out?
I do. And I can't just turn that over to a young person because my intellectual curiosity will not let me. Mm-hmm. I have to dig in.
Mm-hmm. As we've talked this morning, as you've sat there, what do you wish I had asked you that I haven't asked you about as it relates to your career and your role in our history of a wonderful bar association here in Nashville?
I can't think of anything that I wish you had asked me.
Would you do it all again if the Lord came by and said, Jim, I've got a plan for you, help me decide what it is? Would you be a lawyer again?
I would. I can't imagine doing anything else.
Thank you for your time this morning in our program. We appreciate it, Jim.
Thank you, Bob.